there's a big difference, isn't there, between criticism and critique. I think it's as well for us who are involved in these matters to be sensitive to that difference. Critique has to do with questioning and thinking very hard about the way our services and institutions are structured. It's not just naysaying. It's not just gratuitous mudslinging because we don't like something. I think critique has a very serious function in society, and many of us know, particularly those who work in universities, that critique is under threat at the moment. And so part of the value of a session like this for me is that we are sort of engaged in a critique of something, not just criticizing it. So I just want to start by saying that. I'm a psychologist and I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I've worked in the NHS for over 25 years. And I'm Professor of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy at the University of Roehampton, where I spend a lot of time thinking about all this kind of stuff. And so I'm going to be talking very briefly, only for about 10-15 minutes. I'm going to be talking from my experience as a psychologist and psychotherapist in the NHS. And most of my time in the NHS was spent in a service that became an expanded IAPT service. And one of the things that I came to realize about IAPT is that, like many mental health services through the ages, it's a very potent site of myth. And of course, I guess that sounds a bit odd. We usually think of myth as something that belongs back in ancient Greece, but myths aren't, of course, just ancient stories. Organizational myths are central to the work of public sector services and particularly mental health institutions. So I don't think it's altogether surprising that we find three extremely powerful modern myths emerging from within the government's IAPT programme. And let me come straight out with them, straight to the point. Their full titles: The Myth of the Sovereign Consumer, The Myth of Transparency, and The Myth of the Medical Cure for Unhappiness. Now, these are organizational myths that powerfully shape the way we think about ourselves and the way we understand psychological distress. And as I hope to show, if only very briefly and very partially, they're also an organizational means to a political end, one that I think serves the neoliberal agenda underpinning many of our public sector services today. So why do I call them myths? Well, organizational myths do have certain characteristics. Firstly, unlike Greek myths, they're not always dressed up in attractive storylines. Instead, they're usually couched in what Barthes says is innocent speech, something that's superficially obvious or that goes without saying. Myths are widely held but tacit ideas, beliefs, and ideological positions. And in that way, you could say they operate a bit like dead metaphors. They kind of embody ways of thinking that have become so conventional, so normalized, that we fail to notice their metaphors at all. Secondly, while myths are usually presented as something natural, a bit like the weather, they're no such thing. They're actually social constructions. They're produced and developed in response to a particular time, context, and culture, and they evolve as a way of meeting particular organizational demands. And these demands are generally concealed within depoliticized speech, where anonymous statements of apparent fact mask the intentions of an organization. And finally, because they're so embedded in everyday thought and language, organizational myths are never interpreted. They're actually believed. And when they're believed, They're adopted as a kind of sacred narrative whose truth and validity can't be questioned. Generally, the truth of a myth is never established. It's rarely investigated. Any attempt to critique or examine or deconstruct the myth reveals a lack of belief in it and something that's usually regarded as a betrayal by the organisation concerned. So those are some of the ideas that I have about organisational myths, and I just want to briefly touch, as I say, only very partially touch on each of these three modern myths in turn. So let me start with the myth of the sovereign consumer, and this is probably one of the most persuasive and powerful myths circulating within the public sector today. As we know, the prevailing philosophy of neoliberalism, which we have today, we all know and love, has ensured that the methods of the marketplace have been transposed into mental health care. And the effect of this, as many of us know, has been seismic. And I want to pick out only one of its consequences. In a competitive NHS market for care, where I can choose mental health for myself, the notion of relationship is tacitly replaced with the notion of transaction. In a relationship, the ties that bind us together render us vulnerable to and dependent on each other, and Elizabeth was talking about that a moment ago. But in a transaction, we're bound not by the ties of relationship, but only by the logic of the marketplace. We become individual consumers responsible only for ourselves, and we're driven not by the need for care and recognition from others, but rather by the need to maximize our own personal benefit. So the myth of the sovereign consumer is underpinned by a belief in the value of self-sufficiency, and most of all, the value of paid employment. And indeed, the success of IAPT is predicated on returning large numbers of people to work who would otherwise be drawing on the public purse in the form of welfare or benefit payments. But the precaritization of the population that's established via the institutionalization of temporary labor, we have 0 hours contracts, the gig economy and so forth, not to mention the dismantling of our social and welfare services, means that the very conditions necessary to realize such self-sufficiency are undermined. And in fact, there's a tacit agreement within IAPT services to ignore the way in which a commodified demand for self-sufficiency produces and sustains the very emotional distress it's there to relieve. And I think this is one way in which the myth of the sovereign consumer continues to be upheld. Okay, let me turn to the second modern myth of IAPT, the myth of transparency, one of the most cherished ideals of the business world. Organizations, of course, adopt transparency as this kind of ideal that ensures legitimacy and respectability and a guaranteed route to operating without blame. And to this end, as many of you will know, IAPT practitioners are amongst the most closely monitored of any mental health practitioner today. They train in, they carry out standardized assessment and treatment protocols, they record multiple clinical outcome measures for each client contact, and they are pushed to achieve ever higher activity and clinical outcome targets. Elizabeth has talked about what that looks like in some detail. What I just want to note here is it's a kind of disciplinary context to which both the staff in IAPT services and the patients and the clients are subject. And it's all part and parcel of what Michael Power has called the audit culture. Now, in an audit culture, we don't question this demand for such a level of transparency. It's a requirement that seems so obvious it doesn't need explaining any further. Its advantages are taken to be quite literally self-evident. But I think it's based on a kind of tacit assumption that the performance of a mental health service can be seen, and so it can be understood, evaluated, and improved. I kind of want to question that a bit, because I think expert systems that the practitioners exemplify within mental health care are practices that actually cannot fully be rendered transparent. Expert systems demand for their success and effectiveness a significant degree of trust in the expertise and understanding of the practitioner, and that's something that can't be evidenced, or can't be evidenced only through information, data, and statistics. So one of the terrible effects of this persistent drive for transparency is that the language of accountability takes over the language of trust. And with more and more evidence and more data and more statistics, there are fewer and fewer people who have the time or the expertise to establish the validity of the claims being made. And of course, we see that vividly in technicolor detail at the moment with all the statistics available about COVID. But the problem with that is it leads not to increased trust in mental health practitioners, but rather to suspicion. And then the suspicion drives yet more calls for quality assurance and transparency, yet more calls for data and the kind of performance metrics that we were talking about earlier. So this tacit agreement to ignore this very painful paradox that the more you demand transparency, the less trust you have in public sector mental health practitioners, is what maintains the pull of transparency despite what we know to be its harmful effects. Finally, let me turn to the myth of the medical cure for unhappiness. We know that feelings of sadness and loss and hostility and rage don't simply emerge within the psyche of the individual in the same way as symptoms of flu emerge within the body. What we call depression or anxiety is the consequence of a very complex interaction between the individual and his or her social environment, including factors such as poverty, isolation, and the kind of inequalities that, of course, have been laid bare by the COVID-19 crisis. So I think it's all the more surprising to see how the medical model is threaded throughout every aspect of the IAPT programme. Its discourse, its methods, along with the use of very poorly validated but widely used psychiatric diagnoses, are explicitly and repeatedly and uncritically woven into all of its manuals and procedures and protocols. And those same diagnostic systems look set to be used in the new digital and algorithmic versions of therapy that are currently being planned for the NHS. All patients being treated, says the IAPT manual, should receive an adequate dose of the treatment being provided. IAPT clinicians should be able to clearly communicate the evidence base using an analogy to the use of antibiotics to illustrate the importance of the right dose of therapy to feel better. To look at that twice, actually, to sort of get it. But at least something is no longer quite so tacit here, because despite lip service being paid to the idea of an analogy, the explicit reference to the right dose of therapy makes it quite clear that the active ingredient being applied in psychological therapy is to be thought of in the same light as an antibiotic applied to fight infection. CBT, of course, is overwhelmingly privileged as a kind of penicillin. Of course, if all we need is a psychological form of penicillin, then there's little need to address the social, economic, and environmental problems that we know are increasingly evoking serious levels of mental distress. And of course, the psychological explanations now for unemployment are an increasingly commonplace and often, sadly, very humiliating aspect of people's experience of welfare. So the tacit agreement to ignore these growing inequalities of health, wealth, education and privilege and so forth is one of the ways in which the myth of the medical cure for unhappiness maintains a very, very powerful attraction. Okay, I'm nearly finished. The problem, I think, for those of us who work in mental health is that the ongoing industrialization of therapy has really resulted in a tremendously skewed landscape. Our neoliberal market for care has changed, I mean, it's really changed the parameters of our social consciousness. Mental health services have well and truly become embroiled within a political system whose agenda lies far beyond and actually undermines psychological health. The myth of the sovereign consumer means we're already positioned as consumers, ready and willing to accept forms of therapy convenient to the needs of the current political system. The myth of transparency means that many have lost trust in mental health professionals, relying instead on the presentation of a skewed evidence base to make decisions about their psychological care. And the myth of the medical cure ensures the responsibility for any psychological improvement will continue to rest firmly with the individual, not the political system in which the individual is based. Now, these myths are not innocent speech. They don't refer to objective facts, and I think rather they embody a particular way of understanding psychological distress and constitute an organizational means that serves ideological and political ends. And I'm hoping today we can find ways of thinking freshly about these issues and find ways of engaging politically and directly to call out and challenge what I've called these three modern myths of IAPT. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.